With that being said, we have the last speaker today is going to be for this session on privacy and security is Dermot Williams. So Dermot Williams is the Managing Director of Threatscape. Many thanks. Welcome.
Hopefully we'll have some great visuals. There we go. So, thank you very much. I've been working in IT security for longer than I'll admit. And I remember back to when the world was a simple place and the job of the CISO was a very simple task. Then a couple of years ago, the nice folks in Gartner came out with their predictions for what they described as being the mega trends for the next decade. And they identified three major concepts which are going to shape the way that enterprise IT would be designed and deployed around the world. And they were virtualization, mobility, and the adoption of cloud computing. For anybody working in IT security, they were about the three scariest things you can possibly imagine. Because suddenly you can't tell where your users are, you can't predict what devices they'll be using, you can't tell which physical hardware your apps might be running on, you can't even tell for certain without a lot of work what data center your apps might be in. But yet you're still responsible for making sure it stays secure. This is one of the challenges that we've had to face up to and we've had to deal with. I'm going to talk specifically today about the challenge of securing cloud software applications, in other words, the SaaS side of cloud computing, and even more focused on the sanctioned apps. So not the problem of the apps your users are using that you don't even know about, but the ones that you want them to use, the ones that you're sanctioning them to use. Okay, I'm pressing the right button here. There we go. So, Graham Cluley, who's a well-known UK cybersecurity analyst and commentator, has suggested that to properly understand the challenges and risks of cloud computing, you simply need to replace the word cloud with the phrase somebody else's computer at every instance. So the next time one of your colleagues comes and says, I want to move this to the cloud, you just respond and say, okay, you want to move this to somebody else's computer. Or when somebody says, yeah, I trust the cloud, you say, okay, so you trust somebody else's computer. I'm pretty sure you get the idea that that's what you're dealing with, because really you are putting your trust in a totally different organization, a different data center, a different software stack to manage and store and secure your critical data. I'm not saying it's impossible, but you have to go in with your eyes open. So if we look at the way the world has changed from that old simple world I referred to, in the good old days, we had a hard perimeter. You could be confident that if you were the security manager sitting in your ivory tower, there was a nice wall around your building and your users walked in the door in the morning. Your physical assets were inside the building. Your data usage was monitored and managed inside that network perimeter. But that's all gone with the cloud. Not only have we moved to the world of mobility where the users might be outside your network perimeter, but we also now have the situation where the applications may be running on servers entirely outside of your control. And you're sitting there with your network perimeter saying, where's everybody gone? Suddenly you're realizing that you are still responsible, but you're not controlling the servers, you're not defining the software anywhere near as tightly as you used to be able to do. But yet you still have to be able to bring this under your control. So I would suggest to begin with that there are three key questions people need to be asking when their organization is looking to move, or if you realize a little bit late in the day that you've already moved without even being consulted, which often happens for security personnel. So the first question you need to ask is, what software applications in the cloud is my organization using? Because there's a real problem of what we refer to as shadow IT. It is very easy for anybody with 5 minutes, a web browser and a credit card to sign up to use Box or Dropbox or even Salesforce or Office 365 or Google Apps. The list goes on and on. In fact, the last survey I saw by Microsoft identified over 14,000 different providers of software as a service, web, cloud-based apps. When we go into large organizations assisting them to understand this threat, they typically tell us that they have maybe a few dozen apps being used. Then we drill down, we analyze their logs, we look at their firewalls, we examine their proxies, we run some data deep dive analysis for them, and we come back and we sit them down, and we feel like it's almost a doctor-patient time, because we have to explain, you don't have 20 apps, you don't have 30 apps, you've got 320 apps. We had one client, which is a large global firm, where we found almost 1,000 different cloud applications that are being used across their global infrastructure. They had estimated or internally that they might have broken 100. They almost broke 1,000. So suddenly they realize that there's an enormous risk in just trying to lock down which apps are being permitted, which apps are being selected, which data is being moved to the cloud. So first question always is, understand which cloud apps are actually in use, and don't believe you're on top of the problem because it changes day by day. Somebody somewhere in a large organization will always find a way to circumvent the IT rules to try and get their job done quicker. But these people aren't always thinking with a security mindset. In fact, they almost never are thinking from a security perspective. They're just taking shortcuts, well-intentioned maybe, but in ways that can be very dangerous. Once you've identified those cloud applications that you actually mean to be using, that you recognize that your users should be using, you have to ask, have they been properly assessed? Has somebody from marketing chosen some application that's been used to manage databases of customer information without consulting the IT department or the IT security personnel? Has somebody from finance gone and chosen an application that's been used to track your expense management for your staff without consulting the IT security personnel? There are an awful lot of details that go far beyond the speeds and feeds in terms of how well it looks, how pretty the graphs are, what the user interface is like, how much it costs to pay. The stuff that people might think are important when they're choosing a cloud provider, but if you look at the nuts and bolts, you have to think about things like, what are their service level agreements like? What sort of data sovereignty do they have? Will they tell you where your data is stored? Will they give you guarantees that they're deleted when you terminate the service with them? Are you in control of how your data is going to be managed by that cloud service provider? And if you're not doing this sort of determination when you're choosing these providers, you can find yourselves in some very dangerous situations. Do they even promise that you own your data? And there are cloud service providers who don't even put that simple term into their contract. The third point that you need to consider, and this is where it can get pretty scary for those in security, is to understand who is responsible for securing those cloud applications. Just because somebody comes to you and says, oh, it's okay, we put this stuff in Google, they've got $1 billion data center, everything's good, or, you know what, we're using Microsoft Office 365, Microsoft are a big company, they've got it covered. I was on a discussion panel one time with a politician, and she came out with a phrase where she said, but surely Google can fix that. It's like there was a magic wand in Google Labs somewhere which just fixes security. And we had to say, no, that's not how the world works. Even the largest firms don't necessarily have a way of securing absolutely everything. And in fact, what happens is because these firms have lots of developers, but they have even more lawyers, and their lawyers are really, really smart, they write contracts where they describe what we refer to as the shared responsibility model. And that basically means that they promise that if your data gets stolen, it wasn't because somebody broke into their network and breached their firewall and got into their data center. It's more likely they got used to your username or password. And that's your responsibility. Because if somebody turns up with a username and password to one of those cloud sites, almost definitely they're going to be given access. And not just access, they're going to be given the same 99.99% guaranteed uptime that you're paying for, because that's their responsibility, is to let your properly authorized users in to access your data. So you need to secure your users' credentials to make sure that nobody's stealing your data. Because even if you are not responsible for the day-to-day management and operation of a cloud application, if you study the small print, you'll almost definitely find you are still very much accountable for the data. And we'll talk a little bit later about how GDPR will make it very clear that no matter how much you outsource to a processor, you as the data controller still have the ultimate responsibility. My clicker's not clicking very well. There we go. So when you're assessing the cloud service provider, there are a number of factors you need to look at. I'll run through these pretty quickly. There's the service level agreements. You need to understand how they approach data security, how they approach data integrity, also how they approach. You're not in the EU. If you're holding any sort of personal data on people, be they staff, customers, inquirers, anything, you need to be able to comply with GDPR. And if you're using a cloud application, you need to be certain that they too are complying with the GDPR regulations, because otherwise you are in breach as a data controller. So the first thing that people often ask us is, well, hold on, isn't it the case that the cloud service provider just has this covered? We're paying them money, we're paying them every month. Surely they're making sure that systems are secure. And the answer is emphatically no. If you look at the small print in the contracts that Box and Dropbox and Google and Microsoft and any of these people have, if I look at one in particular, if I take the text that Google use, So Google say, to protect your Google account, you have to keep your password confidential. You are responsible for any activity that happens on or through your Google account. Now, it basically means that if your users out there are using the same password on a different website and another website gets breached, then your corporate data can get very quickly compromised. Rami, who's on just before me, spoke about the bots. And the password testing bots or applications like Sentry can test stolen credentials against hundreds or even thousands of websites in a matter of minutes. So suddenly, if you have a staff member whose football club, fan club gets breached and they're using the same username and password, or where some minor e-commerce site with very poor security gets breached and their user has the same username and password, suddenly your Salesforce data is being stolen, or your online finance system is being, or some very critical business data because your users become their weakest link, because that's not the responsibility, or even the possibility in many cases, of the cloud provider to detect that happening. They're unable to tell that that's not your user because all they know is that they have a valid username and password. So this is how a cloud threat becomes different. The first key point is because there's no longer a corporate perimeter to be breached, there's a great ease of access for the attacker. All they need is that user credential. It's the master key that gets them in the door, and now they have direct access to your data. It means that the users typically are the target of the attacker. They're not looking for a big high-tech attack. They simply need to compromise a user, whether it's by putting malware onto their computer, or by fooling them with a phishing attack, or by compromising another site where they're using the same credentials. There are many ways in which it's possible to get access to user credentials. And unfortunately, a lot of the cloud applications don't have detailed monitoring to spot unusual activity. They are improving these ways, and there's a lot of demand from corporate users that they do implement more security, but you need to improve upon the base level of security that they offer. And another challenge that's become more apparent in recent years is that cloud providers have made it easier to tie multiple systems together, so that if one cloud application gets breached, suddenly it's possible for a user to piggyback and access another system, and an entire chain of trust gets breached, whereby compromising one user account on one cloud application, suddenly you have access to an entire range of corporate data. So, a few key points to know about how you go about securing these sanctioned cloud applications, the places you've entrusted with your data. First of all, I'll keep saying it, you have to understand it is a shared responsibility. The guys that you're paying money to will not do all the heavy lifting. You have to take part in securing the data, you have to take part in monitoring, you have to educate your users, you have to monitor your users. And detecting and responding to things is actually very difficult on a cloud system because you're not running that. It's not your system. You can't phone up Microsoft and say, we think we've been breached, can you shut down your data center? And when they stop laughing and hang up the phone, you'll realize that that's not going to happen. In fact, trying to get instant response to work within a cloud environment is also difficult. You need very specialist tools. Because there's no perimeter in the cloud, it means it's possible, as we mentioned, for one compromised account to quickly escalate across to being compromised an entire corporate network. Also, for that corporate network, it's almost impossible to see what's happening without specialist tools because the cloud application sits entirely outside of your sphere. You need to have something which is talking to and monitoring the activities within those cloud applications, and preferably pulling it together from all of your cloud applications into a single pane of glass where you're able to see what's happening. So that, for instance, if I log in right now to one cloud application from Sophia, but I'm logging in at the same time back in my home office in Dublin from a different application, neither one of those applications knows that's happening. But a good cloud security tool will tell me, hold on, that shouldn't be happening. He works hard, but he can't be in two places at one time. Something's gone wrong here, and neither cloud application could have told you that. Also, while it's useful to add tools like encryption, multi-factor authentication, and single sign-on, and these can definitely enhance the security of cloud applications, none of them by themselves are silver bullets. They're useful enhancements, but they do not fix the fundamental problems of cloud security. Now, a few key ways to go about staying protected. First of all, do use a single sign-on if you have it available. It does massively reduce the risk of user credentials being stolen. And user credential misuse is probably the #1 risk we face in cloud computing with cloud apps. Secondly, find a way to centralize the visibility of what's happening across all of your cloud applications. Because otherwise an attacker can compromise multiple systems in a way that you wouldn't determine from the individual security capabilities of the different apps. Thirdly, look for unusual activity, look for anomalies, look for somebody who's logging in from a country they've never logged in from before, or who's downloading a large amount of data in an unusual pattern, or who's using a different time of day than normal, or a new device, or a new IP address, or a new ISP for the first time, and risk score them based on the unusual or out of bounds patterns that you're seeing, because otherwise what an attacker does taking your data will long since have happened by the time you finally realise that they've got inside your cloud application. And because of the way cloud applications can now talk to each other using the API capabilities provided, monitor what happens when clouds talk to clouds, because otherwise stuff can be going on entirely outside of your network that you just don't know is taking place. There's a concept that Gartner christened CASB, or the Cloud Access Security Broker. And if you're responsible for securing cloud application and you haven't heard of CASB, it's definitely time to Google it and read up on the subject. It's a security tool specifically for helping you secure cloud applications. So it acts as a sort of a security event manager and anomaly detector and heuristic rule applier just for cloud applications. So there's a number of companies who are doing this, people like Microsoft, Symantec, SkyHigh, Netscope. There's some very good tools. These can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you of collecting together all the security intelligence across your cloud applications and alerting you when something just doesn't look right. Or you can even put them in line in active mode where if a certain threshold is reached in terms of the certainty that something is wrong, 3 o'clock in the morning, a user account gets automatically detected as being misused, it'll shut it down. You don't need to be there 24/7 monitoring it with the right tool, which will alert you and take action proactively for you. And we're seeing this increasingly being adopted by our large enterprise customers, that they recognize that the 24/7 nature of access to cloud means they need to have a 24/7 capability to recognize and respond to any potential incidents. It's very difficult to stand on any stage in Europe today and talk about any type of security aspect without mentioning GDPR. It's definitely a 4-letter word, and it's something which is concerning for anybody in security. Obviously, it's more related to privacy, but to deliver that privacy, you need to get your security right, and if you don't, the penalties can be considerable. The important factor in terms of a conversation we're having about cloud security is that any organization that's using a cloud application under the regulations is considered a data controller, and the cloud application that you're entrusting with your data becomes a data processor. Now, the nature of the relationships and subcontracting and multiple clouds can become a little bit more complex in the real world, but that's the simple determination within GDPR. And the rules stipulate that the contract you have with anybody who's processing data for you, and therefore your future legal contractual relationship with any of your cloud providers, has to specify the type of data that's being stored, why it's being stored, the nature of the way it's supposed to be processed, the obligations that you have as controller, and you have to pass on to them the same obligations that you've taken on when managing that data. You also have to have it in the contract, and you're legally required to have this in your contract in future, the fact that they will ensure the data is confidential, that they will take appropriate steps to keep it secure. You also have to make sure that they will delete it or return it to you if you terminate a relationship, because you're responsible for managing the data and you can't just wipe your hands of it. And interestingly, GDPR makes even the cloud providers directly responsible for breaches to individual subjects. So if one of your customers has their data stolen because your cloud application gets breached and it was their fault, they're directly liable, and they can't just wash their hands or write into a contract that they don't take that responsibility. Even if they're not based themselves within the EU, as long as the data subject, the individual who was harmed, is in the EU, the cloud provider has direct legal responsibility. So, just to recap some of the key things to think about when you're securing SaaS applications. Make sure you know about what applications are actually being used, and never believe that the task is finished. It's constantly changing because people will always look for, trial, or implement new cloud applications. For those applications you're going to entrust your mission-critical data to, very carefully evaluate them. They're not all created the same, they don't all operate to the same high standards, and they don't all provide the same levels of guarantee about their security and their business continuity. Also, go back to the old school. CIA was the phrase we used to use and still use: confidentiality, data integrity, and data availability. Does your cloud provider satisfy your needs in all three areas? And if they don't, you have to remember the shared responsibility model we talked about. You will have to provide some of the extra security that they don't provide, especially when it comes to user credentials, because user credentials are the weakest link in terms of somebody being able to get access to your data that's in the cloud. And because of that, you need to monitor user activities. You need to be able to spot anything that's anomalous and very quickly react, because otherwise data can be stolen very, very quickly. These are large cloud providers with massive data centers and massive internet pipes. Once somebody breaches one of those systems, they can steal an awful lot of data in a very short amount of time. Encryption and multi-factor authentication and single sign-on can help, but don't believe that just implementing them means you can tick a box and move on. They're a useful supplement, but they're not a magic bullet that will solve everything for you. And also then finally, do prepare for GDPR. And remember, any contract you're signing now for multiple years must take GDPR into account, because it's only 13 months away. If you're not already making it part of your conversation with your cloud provider, and more importantly, if they're not already telling you how they're ready for it, or how they will very soon be ready for it, something is very wrong. So, a couple of links to the places that you can learn more. The Cloud Security Alliance is independent and has a lot of useful information about how you can go about securing cloud usage. And the Open Group also has information coming out of the original Jericho project about deperimeterization and what happens when data moves to places that aren't as easy to secure. Obviously, the various cloud providers have resources on their websites, and the cloud security specialist companies, such as the CASB vendors I mentioned, also have white papers and documents that might be a little bit less unbiased, but can also be quite informative. So, thank you very much.